right. Your Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I'm Assam Ali Murshid, the Director of the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, and on behalf of my colleagues here at the Center, it's my distinct pleasure to welcome you to the 2013 Qatar Postdoctoral Fellowship Lecture. And I'm especially honored to count Ambassador Al-Rumaihi among us tonight, and I thank Your Excellency and the members of the Embassy of Qatar for your support of the Qatar Postdoctoral Fellowship Program. The fellowship was established in 2004 by a generous grant from the State of Qatar to the Center. This is an annual fellowship which is based on a nationwide competition, and it supports a recent PhD working on the topic of U.S.-Arab relations, Arab studies, or Islamic studies. And since 2004, the Qatar Postdoctoral Fellowship and its attending Qatar University Arabic Language Scholarship Program have matured into uniquely rewarding and constructive academic channels between the State of Qatar and the United States and Georgetown University specifically. And the enduring success of these two initiatives is due in no small measure to the attentive support that they have received from Ambassador Al-Rumaihi and from the Embassy of Qatar. And I want to take this opportunity to thank Your Excellency for your continued trust in the Center's stewardship of these two programs, which are very important to us. And tonight we have no better representative of the quality of our Qatar Fellowship Program. And I'm delighted to introduce to you Dr. Adel Iskandar, our 2013 Fellow. Dr. Iskandar is a scholar of media and international communication. He holds a PhD in Communication Studies from the University of Kentucky, a Master of Arts in Communications and Creative Arts from Purdue University, and a double Bachelor of Science in Biology and Social Anthropology from Dalhousie University. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Now, he taught graduate and undergraduate courses at the University of Kentucky, at American University, at the University of Texas, Austin, and he's the author and co-author of several works, including the recently published Egypt in Flux, Essays on an Unfinished Revolution. This is coming out with OUP AUC Press this year. Has come out, right? This thing. And his lecture tonight is entitled America as Chimera, Public Diplomacy Between Journalism and Transculturalism. And please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Adel Iskandar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Abi Mershid, for the very kind introduction. I first want to express my gratitude to the State of Qatar for sponsoring this fellowship that is supporting my research. I especially want to express my gratitude to His Excellency, the Ambassador Al-Rumaihi, for his personal commitment to this fellowship, and having had the opportunity to meet him on several occasions, both in Qatar at the Doha Forum, and then more recently he's expressed a deep commitment to the continuation of scholarship on U.S.-Arab relations, and it's something that I'm both honored and privileged to at least modestly contribute to in some measure. I also want to express my gratitude to the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, which has been, even before this fellowship, my academic and scholarly home for much of the last few years. So it's basically a homecoming, despite the fact that I never left. In the interest of time, I want to talk to you a little bit about this research study. Now, the presentation of this research is a product of my dissertation, my PhD dissertation, which was focused primarily on the analysis of Radio Sawa, one of the U.S. government's media enterprises or media arms that broadcasts largely on radio to the Arab world in 6 different streams across the region, both on FM, AM, and in some instances even on shortwave, depending on circumstances. The dissertation covers a lot of terrain, much of which I won't be able to cover here because of time, but I do want to focus primarily on the cultural dimensions of the analysis. There is It's a two-pronged dissertation research study that focuses on news discourses on Radio Sawa and then also on the cultural entertainment component of the station. There's a video that's been playing in the background, and if you suspected that it was playing by accident, it's not by accident. I'm going to turn up the volume here so you can begin to hear it. Okay. If you can tell me where you may have seen this video before, you should all be familiar with it if you've ever boarded a plane to the US. Anybody recognize it?
Dulles Airport.
Dulles Airport. Most airports that receive international flights where you have to go through passport control and customs, they will play this in the background. And you will, as you wait in line, sometimes extremely lengthy queues, for those who are traveling to the US for the first time or recent immigrants, it's supposed to be your first sort of interaction with America. And as you watch the video, it's a composite, an edited video comprised of imagery and of scenery from across the United States, the various landscapes, and also seems to illustrate the incredible diversity of the American populace. I'm just going to let it roll in the background. You can see, a farmer on a John Deere tractor. I suspect this might be Coney Island. Families of different backgrounds, different descendancies, diasporic communities that seem to illustrate the incredible plurality of American society. Of course, it also showcases the U.S. as a nation without blemishes whatsoever. And so this is, part of the irony, but nevertheless, it is the first thing that travelers to the U.S. see. But what's more interesting about this video is not necessarily the imagery itself, but what underlies the production of this video. This video was commissioned by the Department of Homeland Security and delivered by Disney Studios. They use their own parks and studios and camera crews to deliver the most refined and high caliber production value to ensure that America is presented in a manner not unlike the way it's presented in high level and high budget cinematic productions. So this is America according to the Department of Homeland Security. I start with this by implying that the notion of America as chimera or chimera, depending on pronunciation, is something that I've been particularly compelled with. And admittedly, part of my personal sort of academic background, as is the case with many people of Arab and Middle Eastern descent, driven against their will and coerced to pursue careers in medicine or medical sciences. I started off as a biologist, and so I took a particular interest in genetics, and so as I watched these videos, to me this communicates a sense of creolization and hybridity, almost akin to the notion of the chimera. So, if you will allow me to perhaps, discuss with you the idea of the chimera and why I think it's a particularly relevant theoretical notion that may inform our understanding of how the U.S. depicts itself internationally, I would be very grateful. So, to talk a little bit about the etymology of a chimera. The chimera is a Greek mythological creature. It's a fire-breathing male and female monster, so it's basically androgynous. And it exists, at least in mythology, in Asia Minor. Its body is comprised, as you can see, of a lion, a serpent head that emerges from the tail, and a goat whose head rises up from the center of the back. It's not unlike other hybrid creatures in ancient mythology, like the centaur or the minotaur or Pegasus. But interestingly, the chimera has many different sort of iterations and representations. The one on the right-hand side here is actually an Etruscan masterpiece that dates back to 1553. It's known as the Chimera of Arezzo. And there are others as well. This one is actually kind of a comical one. For those of you who may have seen Napoleon Dynamite, a film that, it's called a liger, incidentally. It's a male lion and a tigress bred with each other. This hybrid is meant to sort of immortalize and popularize, or the film is meant to immortalize and popularize the cult classic Napoleon Dynamite, the high schooler who imagines the beauty and the incredible power of this creature. So there's been sort of a deep fascination with hybridity, both in ancient mythology and in contemporary popular culture. Chimeras are also very specific genetic descriptors of actual organisms, in many instances animals, that are comprised of cells that originate in multiple populations. So this might be a pretty comical image of a liger, but ligers actually do exist. In the same way that tigons, which is the opposite in matching up of an animal, of a lion and a tiger. But why am I describing this? I'm describing this because, to a large extent, the argument that I'm trying to make here is that the United States, in and of itself, actually represents some sort of, or is exported in the context of a cultural chimera. That for the United States to continue to compete, functionally speaking, in a highly universalized world where globalization and localization forces are both in immediate sort of contravention of each other, but also dovetail with one another with great complementarity, it is necessary for the United States to appear to be inclusive of multiple cultural intonations and cultural indications. The composite of images here is indicative of some of the projects that the United States government either directly or indirectly sponsors or funds or facilitates for cultural production for international consumption. In the top left-hand corner, you'll see a young man doing what appears to be an incredible somersault on a stage. He represents the Dance Motion USA, which is a State Department funded initiative that sends urban dancers from across the United States, but primarily from Brooklyn, across the world to promote intercultural exchange and to demonstrate artistic and creative production from the US. Immediately below that, there's an image of 3 comedians. This is they belong to a comedy troupe called Make Chai Not War, and it's a composite program that brings together comedians of Muslim and Hindu background. And they, of course, most of them, actually all of them, are American citizens, and they travel to India and go on tours to illustrate the incredible harmony that exists within U.S. society vis-a-vis the interaction between multiple faiths and communities. To the top right-hand corner, this is a shot from a fairly famous Voice of America program that broadcasts to Iran. It's called Parasite, and it's basically modeled to resemble The Daily Show. Of course, Jon Stewart's infamous program, and it's immensely popular by some accounts, and deeply valorized and hated by other accounts. And the bottom right-hand corner, everybody should recognize Mohammed Assef, the winner of Arab Idol, of course, a very critical and important American cultural export, not just to the Arab world, but across the region, that the U.S. government had an instrumental role in negotiating contracts for across both in the Arab world and elsewhere. And at the center, the image, you may be able to recognize the incredible familiarity of the artistic style that this poster was made with. It resembles, of course, the infamous Obama poster by Shepard Fairey. In this case, it is a young woman looking up with what looks like a musical script in the background, and the program is called Sing Egyptian Woman, Ghanni Ya Masriya. And it's basically a competition show to encourage young women in Egypt to come forth and and sing songs or record their performances, their vocal performances, in a competition sponsored and funded by the US Embassy in Cairo. Incidentally, Egyptian women have been singing in Egypt for a very long time. Which brings us to what public diplomacy means and why is it necessary for us to think about cultural outreach of this sort. There's of course a critical juncture when it became necessary or important for the US government to begin to instrumentalize public diplomacy in a different way. And arguably the events of September 11th precipitated a transformation of the Arab Muslim world in the perception of US government institutions. It also precipitated direct military engagements, both in Iraq and Afghanistan, which of course actualized direct confrontation. In addition to that, of course, discursively, at least within sort of academic debate and deliberation, or in some instances, pseudo-academic debate and deliberation, there was an incredible focus on ideological and civilizational contestation furthered by Samuel Huntington's argument. And then, not too distant from that, there was a growing hostility towards any indigenous, local or regional media production emerging from the Arab world. The example of which, of course, is Al Jazeera, and the extent to which Al Jazeera was demonized and vilified in the United States between the years 2001, immediately after September 11th, all the way through until, to this day actually, you'll still be able to see that with the launch of Al Jazeera America, there's a tendency for there to be reactionary critique of the network. So the perception that the media environment in the Arab world is by and large hostile to the US, with limited justification or without sort of conceivable explanation. And then, of course, there was the view that the Bush administration at the time was in tremendous need of being able to combat misperceptions of the US, as opposed to the recognition that policies needed to be revisited and revised. And, of course, there was a growing ideological exceptionalism, and the view that the prospects of success are actually tenable. Now, the problem with this sort of vision of a transformation in public diplomacy, particularly in the early 2000s, between 2001 after September 11th attacks through until the Iraq War 2003, all the way through to 2008, is the ability to identify immediate adversaries. So as we look through the literature on public diplomacy, it becomes more and more nebulous and more complicated to be able to identify what the immediate adversary is. Is it the Arab media that's a problem that needs to be contested? Of course, you would often hear in congressional hearings and in debates within the Broadcasting Board of Governors a whole debate revolving around whether or not the U.S. needs to have a horse in the race, that it needs to compete, that Arab media is too hostile, and there needs to be a voice to speak on behalf of the United States, as opposed to utilizing the pre-existing sort of architecture of broadcasting in the region. So, who are the adversaries? Is it the Arab media? Are they the Arab and Muslim publics that have traditionally, or at least increasingly over the past 10, 15 years, have increased their level of animosity towards the U.S., with polls and surveys seeming to indicate that this situation continues to become more and more aggravated? Or is it the religious right in the region that needs to be in some way tempered? Or is it abstractions? In many instances, the literature on public diplomacy in the 2000s, all the way through until probably a couple of years ago when there was a dramatic rearticulation, is a focus on being able to combat ignorance, combat fundamentalism, combat anti-Americanism, combat false perceptions of U.S. policy, all of which are lofty abstractions and very difficult to really tackle. Keeping in mind that there are deeply sort of complicated lexical dilemmas in the context of public diplomacy specifically. There was a time not too long ago when it wasn't uncustomary for US government officials to call public diplomacy propaganda. There was an office of propaganda, and it was sort of known as such, and that's exactly what it did. It promoted US government agendas and interests, or perceived interests. Today, this is a very different dynamic. And so, euphemistically speaking, there is a desire and a need to re-articulate the discourse and the narrativization of public diplomacy. In addition to that, the problem has been imagining the public. Every broadcast entity, every news organization, every journalistic outlet needs to imagine its own audience and have some conception of who it's communicating to. And so the reception studies conducted for public diplomacy instruments in the early 2000s seem to indicate that the Arab public has changed, and changed dramatically enough to warrant a shift in the outreach. The other major dilemma is in-house, within these enterprises, within these broadcast entities. Does the US government broadcast, or the US government funded and sponsored broadcast represent the state of the US, or does it represent the people? And is there continuity between those two? And how does it represent America if America is so diverse and pluralistic and complicated and impossible to consummately capture and represent? Which basically means that there is a fundamental battle of ideas within the context of being able to push an agenda for the US government. This battle of ideas is often suppressed, largely because of the primacy of being able to send out a coherent message internationally. That you cannot have an incoherent message if your policy objectives is to win hearts and minds. So this is where, you know, of course, my research actually historicizes public diplomacy very extensively, and I'm not going to belabor you with these details, all the way from the interwar period through to post-1945 and during the Cold War. But nevertheless, I think it's important to note that there are instruments of public diplomacy that are extremely telling in the manner in which they functioned, like Empire Radio, in the BBC, for instance, which of course was unabashedly called Empire Radio. Propaganda offices, offices of war, information, the waging of ideological warfare, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and their intent to undermine or chip away at the Iron Curtain and the attempt to empower publics against Soviet rule in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union. In the more contemporary context, the Radio Sawa platform, which of course is a subset of the broadcast enterprise from the US, is the shift from elites to publics. The precursor to Radio Sawa, the Voice of America Arabic, was of course a broadcast that had fairly sizable reach, especially during the pre-satellite era. And during that time, it was considered literally the voice of America. So when government directives were broadcast internationally, you knew that you were listening to the US government. That, of course, has changed somewhat, but I think my research shows that despite the aesthetic transformations, functionally speaking and ideologically speaking, little has actually transformed from that era. But nevertheless, Voice of America turned into Radio Sawa largely to be able to appeal to a more substantial proportion and constituency within the Arab publics, and that constituency is focused primarily on the youth between the ages of, let's say, 15 and 35. That is the new target audience. Voice of America Arabic at the time was geared towards the aristocracy, the intelligentsia, the economic elite in each of those countries. Today, it's a different community entirely. And then also, in addition to that, much of these broadcasts were inspired by, or at least took a few hints from Joseph Nye and Norman Pattis, specifically gearing their approach using soft power as opposed to hard power, which is often articulated in the form of entertainment and music. So it explains why you have dance troupes and comedy groups traveling across the region, and you could begin to see in those images the kind of transformations. Today, if public diplomacy could reach a zygotic fetus, then it probably would. But nevertheless, at the core of this is actually a fairly substantial discussion about journalism. At the end of the day, Al-Hurra and Radio Sawa, the two largest enterprises within U.S. government broadcasting to the Middle East, are anchored on the notion that they're able to deliver what is described as objective, impartial news that meets journalistic, professional standards and values. And that is exactly what I intended to investigate. I mean, do they deliver on this promise? And is this promise actually achievable in any sort of functional way? So, in the context of this discussion, I want to... Sorry, a little too soon. I want to read you. Radio Sawa officials describe their broadcast as an upbeat mix of Western and Arabic pop music, along with up-to-the-minute news analysis, interviews, opinion pieces, sports, and features on a wide variety of political and social issues. Much of the broadcast is comprised of long streams of uninterrupted music using disc jockey format. There is nobody on site to actually shift between tracks or to communicate with a live audience. The songs which air on the station alternate between Western, mostly American top 40 hits, and Arabic popular songs. While the musical lineup differs for all 6 of the Radio Sawa services that target different geographical regions, the overall programming format for all streams is a departure from previous foreign and local radio services in the Arab world. Radio Sawa rarely broadcasts classical Arabic music, but rather focuses on primarily Western genres like hip-hop, Eurodance, slow hits, Latin, salsa, merengue, and top singles from Arabic, Turkish, and Greek charts. Typically, the music that you expect, let's say for instance, if you're looking at regional hip-hop acts, those rarely make their way on Radio Sawa. So it's not focused on the sort of indigenous grassroots production of alternative musical content, but rather on the more sort of commercialized, commodified versions of this local content. The American music on Radio Sawa often includes tracks from the 80s and 90s that are still popular among Arab listeners, and this is determined by fairly extensive focus groups that are conducted in major Arab cities to determine what's the hot track at any given time in each of those countries. So it's not uncommon for popular songs from artists in Egypt, the Gulf, rhyme music from Algeria, Shabmami, Shab Khaled, Rashid Taha, Nawal Zogli, Marcel Khalid, all the names that, for those of you who are familiar, would recognize, to feature prominently on Radio Sawa. The station's identification, which serves as an interlude separating musical segments, is an engaging jingle comprised of sounds of stimulating lasers and wind blowing interwoven with snippets of popular music laced with words of promotion. While field journalists tend to reflect the dialects of their respective sites of reporting, usage of the colloquial Lebanese accent is comparatively prevalent in all non-news content on Radio Sawa. Even on the Egyptian stream, where we know that Egyptians typically don't listen to anything that's not Egyptian, or to a lesser extent. In contrast to news in Arabic, which tends to be classical and formal, colloquial Lebanese offers a more intimate and informal disposition, which appeals primarily to young people in the region. In recent years, there is little empirical research documenting this phenomenon. Much like the old days of Voice of the Arabs, when Arab song diva Kulthum galvanized audiences from the Atlantic to the Gulf, music is again being employed as an essential ingredient in the outreach to Arab audiences. So for anybody who followed Voice of the Arabs during that time, of course a few of us have witnessed it firsthand, but at least read about it, the idea that streets would be empty. But it was definitely a concerted effort by then President Nasser to bring together to create a confluence between revolutionary politics on one end and musical production, so as to galvanize audiences and commit them to the network and develop brand loyalty for Voice of the Arabs. So in essence, there's definitely import in utilizing music. Fundamentally, music is the lifeline of stations like Radio Sawa, without which the broadcast would not have consolidated large audiences. Some consider Radio Sawa's music the bait which draws audiences to the station and allow exposure to the news and public diplomacy messages. So arguably, if you're listening to a full sort of musical stream with occasionally interspersed news broadcasts, the question is, will you listen? And most surveys seem to indicate that audiences do not actually listen long enough to pay attention to the news content, which brings up the issue of whether or not the public diplomacy content, if you will, is actually accomplishing what it needs to accomplish. But if we were to think of stations like Radio Sawa as a flowchart, we've got two separate sort of components. One component is the public diplomacy domain, and the other component is the cultural hybridization domain. The idea that you've got all this music intermixed with each other, and that's what typically people listen to, and it comprises at least 80% of the content. But that's not where that might be the hook, but it's not actually the substantive content. And when congressional hearings are held to discuss whether or not Radio Sawa actually accomplishes its goals, the key indication is not actually popularity of the station or whether or not people listen to the music, but rather whether or not it's having any impact in terms of an uptick in the favorability of the US among those who are listening to it. And in many instances, the answer is a definitive yes, largely because it's a self-selecting group. Those who are listening to Radio Sawa and tolerating their news content are more than likely going to be people who agree with the political message of the US government, but rather the competition is also becoming so fervent that the Radio Sawa model has been transferable. But nevertheless, you can begin to see the incredible disequilibrium between those two dynamics. On one level, you've got a tremendous amount of energy and money being expended on the news content that is no more than 20% and has very limited listenership, and musical content which doesn't cost anything fundamentally, and attracts audiences, but creates a favorable impression of American popular culture and creative production without a political undertone, or at least that's what it's meant to do. Which of course raises the question of whether to keep a station like this running for as long as it has, does it not make sense to an extent that this station perhaps is intended to do exactly what it has not been articulated to do, which is to create an environment of relative cultural hybridity that can allow for a more receptive climate for American political views and perspectives. So, with that being said, the programming that I analyzed was focused primarily in 2005 at the height of the Iraq War and well into the Bush's second presidency. And the analysis that I used was critical discourse analysis along the lines of the work of Norman Fairclough and Tion van Dijk. Again, this is something that I'm not going to cover in detail, but I would refer you to my dissertation if you're interested in reading more about it. But nevertheless, there are critical points here before talking about whether or not stations like Radio Sawa are successful at accomplishing their mission. The question is, what is their mission? The articulated mission is the following. One, for Radio Sawa to be a model for journalism. Okay? Secondly, that it promote and project the US government. Thirdly, advocate American values. 4, increase ratings and audience. 5, transform public opinion. And 6, actually there is no 6. 6 is my sort of interjection by saying that these are so utopian and so far-fetched it's impossible to actually accomplish. But the problem here is the fact that some of those objectives are in direct conflict with one another. How do you present professional journalism while at the same time having as an objective the intent to shift public opinion? And so obviously there are a lot of intertwined problems here. At the end of the day, public diplomacy, functionally speaking, is if seen in the context of, or if depicted in the form of a flowchart, begins at the very top with ideological production. I mean, it wouldn't be public diplomacy if there wasn't a state enterprise or an institutional sort of oversight and to an extent an editorialization of content. And then passed down in the form of strategic message construction, perhaps through hiring processes and utilization of human resources by identifying talent to position them in a particularly strategic manner to ensure that the messages are delivered in a functional way, and then the translation and customization to various audiences, and finally with dissemination. The outcome of all of this is in terms of news and journalism, and again, I'm really skipping a lot of different stages, but I think you would find it useful to see what the findings of this study have produced, is that I was focused primarily on 4 different conflict areas or topical areas. The first being the representation of Iraq, of course, being a major part of the conflict or a major part of current events coverage in the media in 2005. Most of the frames represented on Radio Sawa seem to depict that anyone who is in opposition of the United States is a terrorist, that religious leaders who are, the majority of religious leaders in Iraq are opponents of the United States. Now again, I've reached those findings through a fairly elaborate process of macro proposition analysis through discourse analysis, and if you're interested, I can elaborate how that happened, but in the interest of time, I've reduced it down to the main points. That the United States military's conduct in Iraq is largely professional and without much fault. That Iraqis support regime change, the majority of Iraqis support regime change, that Iraqi democracy is hopeful, and that the neighbors of Iraq prefer a post-Saddam Iraq. And lastly, that the majority of US opponents are militants, or that they're armed folks, so they're not civilians. So a de-civilianization of American opposition. This is in the context of Iraq. And the other, of course, there's another component that looks at a far more perennial problem in the region, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and how that's depicted on Radio Sawa. In most instances, or as a product of this macro propositional analysis, the U.S. Is depicted as, to some extent, actually in disagreement with Israel. So, contrary to policy expectations here, or what we typically hear from both the U.S. private media in the United States, but also from major political players. When it comes to Radio Sawa, the U.S. is represented as, in some instances, not in full agreement with Israel on several issues. But nevertheless, there are some salient motifs that continue to exist, such as that Israel is at a constant threat, that Israel is actually protecting Palestinians and Palestinian rights, that Palestinians have not presented a partner in peace. Of course, these are fairly well-known points, but it's interesting to see that emerge from the news coverage of the region on an Arabic network sponsored by the US government for Arab audiences. And then lastly, that the Palestinian leadership is incapable of leading. There are other topics as well that I think are interesting. At the time, there wasn't, of course, the situation in Syria was extremely turbulent, but in no way similar to where it is today. But you could begin to see the politicization of adversity, particularly when it comes to the perception of the Syrian regime at the time. But there are sort of cross-cutting political statements that run throughout the broadcast that are very difficult to challenge and also very difficult to identify any contrary messaging. For instance, the majority of regimes in the region are dysfunctional. So when I coded literally every depiction of a government in the region, in most instances the representation was either neutral or dysfunctional, that the US was committed to freedom and democracy, that the Arab public, again, this is 2005, 2006, that the Arab public is ambivalent and apathetic, ironically, that Israel is normalized in every conceivable way, and that in many instances the public lacks opinion. In many instances as well, the US is represented as having no politics whatsoever. So almost an invisibility, creating sort of an air of a Pandora's box, that things happen in the region without US involvement, intervention, support, advocacy of any kind. So basically sort of pulling the US factor out. In some instances, even in countries where the US has direct military involvement. And of course, there's repetition and cultivation, which is a large process of creating notions of understanding. The story order, in many instances, was completely different from the story order on transnational broadcasting in the Arab world, from the Arab world. That some stories were privileged over others, and that the broadcast, by and large, was replete with technical errors that I'm not going to go into, but I imagine that over time, much of these errors have been rectified. So the question is, how do you win hearts and minds when you have such an ambivalent discourse? For those of you who are up on your latest pop culture, can you name who these two beautiful young women are? On the left-hand side, maybe you can name who that is.
Shakira?
Who is it?
Shakira?
Close, but no.
Is it Mariah?
It's Beyonce. Yeah, I know, it's kind of a... And who's on the right?
Beyonce's sister?
Beyonce's sister. It's... Who is that? Noelle Zobi? Noelle Zobi? Yes? Okay. So, Noelle Zobi... So, you guys are not up.
They all look the same.
There you have it. They look the same. So, interestingly, Beyonce and Noelle Zobi are the most aired musicians on Radio Sawa. So when you do a full count, or when I did a full count of number of tracks per artist in the period that I analyzed, those two musicians had the most number of tracks played. Incidentally, I mean, when I was looking for images, it just so happened that I found them wearing American-style cowboy hats, seemingly implying that the two are either interchangeable or that they themselves are a product of a deeply Americanized cultural implication or tendency. But again, the key here is, or the question that this raises is, how do we come to understand the cultural chiasms, or the meeting points between cultural imagery, between the representation of America in different contexts. So I want to sort of read you a couple of segments here from my study. In examining hybrid discourses on Radio Sawa, it is clear that there's an underlying tension between two currents. On the one hand, by recognizing the intrinsic mixing and creolization of all cultural realms, the broadcasters might be seen as simply delivering hybrid content to willing recipients for whom such production is in no way dissonant. In the same line of reasoning, hybrid messaging in the form of broadcast, multilingual, and global music is seen as justifiable from an intention standpoint, as it aims to increase familiarization with and the appeal for translocal styles, trends, tastes, and folklores. On the other hand, it is clear that both the impetus and the manner in which musical content is hybridized via Radio Sawa are firmly rooted in a pragmatic way. Sorry, I accidentally hit that. pragmatic way and does not disturb the distribution of power. Hence, there are grounds for argumentation on both sides of this debate. However, the subject of this study is the assessment of Radio Sawa's hybridity itself, that it must arise from a close examination of the station's objectives, processes, design, the choice of inclusion and omission, definitions of culture, and delivery. This was done in a variety of ways. But nevertheless, I think it's important to note that there is an interdialect programming that exists in a very functional way across the station, and that this interdialect seems to imply that Radio Sawa, as a station, not only represents the intermixing between Arab discourses and American discourses, but rather has come to subsume the Arab world as a cultural microcosm. So that Radio Sawa is probably one of the very few stations that has multiple streams where you could switch between channels and listen to primarily Rai music or primarily Egyptian music or primarily Khaliji music and switch between those stations. And so that the implication is that to listen to popular music from your country, you need to come to the US, or virtually speaking, turn on or tune in to an American-funded network to be able to access that. And that in and of itself is precisely one of the objectives of this public diplomacy enterprise, as opposed to the clearly articulated objectives otherwise. That this is to create this, that the U.S. government creates the space for intermixing, as opposed to allow pre-existing spaces to prevail. Now, there are different ways to sort of think about this, and public diplomacy continues to sort of shift and transform. Of course, the way in which public diplomacy is often understood and articulated is in the context of sort of a chief diplomat who travels around the world to advocate on behalf of political interest. Anybody recognize who's on the top frame? Yeah. Okay. So Karen Hughes, probably not the most celebrated of American diplomats in her quest to reach out to the Middle East, but of course it offered plenty of opportunities for photo ops across the region. But nevertheless, I think the directionality of public diplomacy has moved towards more interesting, compelling innovations. The bottom left-hand corner is a video game made to bring together Palestinians and Israelis to solve a puzzle together, or something along those lines. I don't know really how it works. But on the right-hand side, you've also got Second Life, which is actually out of fashion now. But at the time, it was quite a trendy way for young people to interact in virtual space. But it was basically public diplomacy in Second Life, where events and lectures and seminars and performances were held on Second Life, and those who were interested could actually go and attend those. So the argument that I'm trying to make here is that even though the intention might be sort of a justifiable one to utilize cultural messaging to bring together communities that are in some ways disparate, either politically or geographically, that unfortunately the Radio Sawa model is less functional, and in fact produces hybridity as juxtaposition. So it's at this point that it becomes imperative to characterize the kind of hybridity that's exhibited by Radio Sawa in its musical production. So when you couple Rai, reggaeton, Egyptian Sha'bi music as contemporary manifestations of musical tradition, what you're doing is you're amalgamating, but in a very inorganic way, these tracks. So when you're listening to a station, and you go between Amr Diab and Christina Aguilera, that doesn't really communicate anything functional about it. I mean, there may be a similarity in terms of style and genre, or there may be sort of a sense of harmony. You'll remember the way in which, or at least people my age, when we used to make mixtapes, you prepare mixtapes, and the manner in which you order tracks, and that's basically the DJ's responsibility, may show the ability to, or the acuity in terms of identifying musical tracks and how they mix with each other. Pandora now does that for us in a fairly sort of successful way. But beyond that, Radio Sawa is not actually producing any sort of instrumental way of hybridization. So, for instance, when a Rai track comes on, it doesn't necessarily communicate sort of anything beyond the shuffling of instrumentalized sounds and styles from Franco-Maghrebi cultural identities. It doesn't historicize it in any way. It doesn't tell you anything about it. The music is effectively dehistoricized, uprooted, and exists in a sort of a parallel sphere of absolute and utter disengagement. In fact, a unique opportunity, Radio Sawa could have been able to address the sense of migration and estrangement that comes with sort of the ethnomusicology of cultural production, but instead it's only helped entrench disenfranchisement by dehistoricizing it. So what I have argued and would like to further as an argument, and I promise you that it won't be long because I feel like I've been speaking for too long, is this notion of imperial transculturalism. Since the early days of public diplomacy, the United States government has effectively appropriated cultural innovation rather than overseeing its production. By appropriating and assimilating transculturalism for export, U.S. government facilitates state diplomacy in the international arena. The problem with a global transculturalism that is imparted by a superpower like the United States is that resistance to these discourses is as culturally totalitarian in equal measure to the imperial ambition of that state. For instance, dissident expression against a transcultural American expression would necessarily be adamantly nationalistic and anti-global. There are examples of such expressions from the Zapatistas to conservative Islamist groups who reject transnational cultural production on the grounds that it is corrupting and disempowering. This kind of protectionism is justified through the same logic that perceives American domination of international communication as a threat to local cultural mores. This configuration produces a dilemma for any anti-imperial positionality. When the imperial project adopts transcultural expression as its dominant means of outreach and influence, resisting the superpower often manifests as a rejection of hybridity itself. It is in this vein that Radio Sawa constitutes one manifestation of a novel mode of strategic international communication, which I refer to here as imperial transculturalism. Without having to review the literature to discuss this, I want to at least state that Radio Sawa offers an incompatibility of objectives. Alternatively, another model can be used as a point of theoretical departure to understand Radio Sawa's production that is of corporate transculturalism. While it shares with the network the emphasis on transculturalism, the priorities are starkly different. Corporate transculturalism, which is something that we'd mostly be familiar with, is focused first and foremost on centers of production, opening new markets, and outright protection of copyright and patent. These are contrary to Radio Sawa's ideology and approach. Furthermore, the corporate model is one that focuses primarily on generating profit. An instrument of public diplomacy is concerned with increasing the favorability of the U.S. among station audiences. Nevertheless, Radio Sawa remains a repository and distribution channel for the products of corporate transculturalism nevertheless. Hence, while governed by the same motivations and objectives as cultural imperialist projects, the content of the broadcaster, in this case Radio Sawa, is the yield of corporate transcultural industries. Imperial transculturalism can be viewed as an amalgamation of cultural imperialism and corporate transculturalism. Marwan Crady, who writes extensively about the notion of critical transculturalism, offers a fairly interesting and compelling argument for how transculturalism could be used as a dissident posture to critique globalized discourses. My intervention in this case is to offer a far more perhaps ominous view that transculturalism in and of itself is potentially co-optable and can be used by the imperial posture to promote to sort of promote expansionism, etc. So imperial transculturalism, as I would describe it, has several characteristics that I'm going to list. First and foremost, it has to be fundamentally pluralistic. It has to appear to be synthetic. It has to appear to be multicultural, and that the dominant posture is in hybridity, that it goes from structure to social practice, that it privileges the confluence of global, local, contextual, translocal, and intercontextual, that it is material, institutional, discursive, and textual, and that it offers a space for dialectic. But nevertheless, there is little space for actual and true intertextuality. That alternating between local and external forces in many instances overwhelms local forces by allowing them to become little more than tokenistic symbols for the representation of dominant tropes. And I want to say that this image, I've showed you images. I don't know if any of you are familiar with these. These are cultural diplomatic productions that are, in fact, incidentally, these are all from Layalina Productions, a company based here in Washington, D.C., which is often where State Department money is outsourced to produce programming. The top left-hand corner, American Caravan, takes a group of young Americans across the Middle East and, of course, shoots it in reality television style. You can see that there are a couple of women who are wearing the niqab. I'm not going to say anything there. And the bottom left-hand corner, On the Road in America, is the opposite of that, where basically a group of young men and women are taken from or are sent traveling across the United States through different locales, and their interactions with Americana is documented also in reality television format. Top right-hand corner, Ben and Izzy is an animated show depicting a young Arab man and a young Arab boy and a young American boy who go on a quest to find treasures in ancient lands, mostly in the Middle East. The bottom right-hand corner is a program also by Layalina Productions called Sister Cities. In this case, the right-hand corner is I think he's the mayor of Casablanca. Could be. I think he's the mayor of Casablanca, and the person to his left is an American mayor. I'm not sure where exactly, but basically you can see how there's the desire to bring together all of this, of course, for audiences to perceive and view and contemplate. So Radio Sawa's imperial transculturalism differs significantly from the axiomatic participatory spaces produced by organic communities of cultural production. For instance, Andean musical genres that sprouted out of local cultural intersections produced various musical genres, hybrids of Andean folkloric music, rock, and international balada. And while the political economy of globalization remains a determinant in the success of some artists within this genre, as the style itself becomes urbanized and affected by bourgeoisie sensibilities, it is nevertheless socially and culturally informed by an experience of music through communities of active agents and not passive consumers. The greatest threat posed to Radio Sawa's access, popularity, and impact in the regions where it broadcasts is from the stations and networks, radio and television, that share its hybrid content, but are more organic, local, and evidently contrapuntal. In other instances, some networks have essentially borrowed the Radio Sawa model, but because of their geographic, cultural, political, and economic proximity to their respective communities, they are able to outperform Radio Sawa in many of these markets. Some have even gone ahead and incorporated bilingual content so as to compete in the same market with Radio Sawa. These exist in every one of the network's markets, including in Egypt, for instance, Nugum FM, Nile FM, even on television, for instance, again, similar models that are far more appealing because of the ability to visualize on NBC and Rotana FM in other markets across the region. Arguably, these programs are more competitive than Radio Sawa because of their localization through programming, their perceived authenticity, their interactivity, the fact that they're able to actually take calls from viewers. Radio Sawa can't take calls because there's nobody in the studio. And specialization, as most of these do not carry newscasts, therefore music programming is uninterrupted. Who wants to listen to music with interruption, either with news or commercial advertising? For this reason, and despite Radio Sawa's adamant efforts to access any and all markets in the region and compete on a level playing field, these networks not only offer a more convincing product, they are not affiliated to an institution and nation state deemed unfavorable by audiences, or at least so it seems. Hence, those that grafted the Radio Sawa's bilingual model and perceived as transcultural but do not have to mingle in stigma are no longer have to behave or appear to be driven by imperial prerogatives. In closing, I want to say that in the end, this study aimed to examine the intersections of policy and journalism, two notions that are seemingly at odds. Radio Sawa's discourse, specifically through internal editorial oversight or extreme pressure, is perceivably as partial both palpably and subliminally. The discourse analysis of news programming illustrates the dominant frames employed during the period of study. By identifying the overarching narrative trends in news discourse, we can comprehend not only context of news, but also infer the ideological framework that may inform it, as well as the construction of reality on Radio Sawa. Unlike most independent corporate broadcasters, Radio Sawa has a colossal and unenviable task of trying to promote a global superpower and international political behemoth to an audience and citizenry that have a wide dislike for it. The tools it has been given by the operational headquarters at the Broadcasting Board of Governors are the promise of open, free, unhindered journalism and an amalgam of the world's music. I have argued that this chimera of an organization expresses a directional trend in cultural diplomacy in the US and globally, which has, by virtue of its hybridity, become an all-encompassing and subsuming in a manner that changes our conception and theorization of power in the international communication. I refer to this as Imperial Transculturalism, but beyond that, if we were to take this description outside the context of Radio Sawa, we can begin to understand the manner in which international politics, namely in the manner in which the US government is represented today, has mirrored what Radio Sawa looks like. And in closing, this is an image from a website of a writer and conservationist called Kelsey Timmerman. He posted this image to remind his followers that in America we are all too that we're all too isolationist and that we don't care much about the world. And he encourages American audiences and American publics to explore international news from international news sites. So he will often say, do you know what people in Timbuktu think of Americans? If you don't, then find a newspaper in Timbuktu that describes Americans. So I would argue that that over the past decade, and particularly during the Obama administration, there has been a conscious effort to depict America not simply as a microcosm of the world, but as a cultural melange that subsumes all of the world's discourses. Not unlike the 1985 US for Africa song written by Michael Jackson and Lionel Richie, We Are the World, today public diplomacy in the US purports to signify the kind of national universalism that suggests and reflects the totality of global experience. While humanistically, this is a welcomed transformation from the domineering narratives of othering and exceptionalism that the US has so often been an advocate of, it nevertheless presents a worrying transculturalism that, coupled with expansionist realist political objectives and the utilization of military might, could have greater imperial repercussions than the rigid American particularities of yesteryear's diplomatic outreach. Thank you.
Thank you, Adel. We're a bit over time, but I think we have about 15 minutes for Q&A, but that means you'll really have to keep your questions short and your answers even
Even
shorter
shorter.
to the brief. Thank you all very much. And thanks, Adel, for a very wealthy presentation.
Thank you.
And I'll leave it to you to comment.
Okay, sure.
So based on all of these problems, so you demonstrated a lot of issues with the Radio Sawa as it currently stands. How do you think that model can be improved, or is it something that should be scrapped entirely?
No, I don't think the model needs to be scrapped entirely. It just needs to become specialized. If Radio Sawa is going to be a news programmer, a news programming entity, then it can definitely learn from pre-existing networks that are funded by foreign offices such as the BBC. BBC has retained, to a large extent, its reputational credibility internationally, despite being funded by the British public and being sort of overseen and monitored and evaluated by the Foreign Office. So to a large extent, Radio Sawa tries to do too much, and I think that's where it shoots itself in the foot. But nevertheless, it has consolidated a market in the region, which has been sort of the compelling reason to keep it for as long as it's been around. So, for instance, the Government Accountability Office has issued numerous analyses and evaluations of Radio Sawa's performance, and in almost every circumstance, the benefits have outweighed its failures. And of course, being the smaller organism in the larger broadcast enterprise, with Al-Hurra basically garnering and costing more than Radio Sawa, or eclipsing it in terms of budget, Radio Sawa actually looks like a fairly successful project. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, you've got it's like Al-Hurra's the limp foot, and Radio Sawa is actually doing quite well. The contradictions that I think I'm helping illustrate suggest that to retain the public diplomacy messaging in the context of news programming is probably a major hindrance to the station, and something that they can do away with entirely. In fact, I would argue that the news programming today on Radio Sawa is extremely inferior to its predecessor, Voice of America Arabic. It's simply not even worth listening to in a functional sense. And nevertheless, it does cost a fair amount of money. I mean, there's a pooling of newsrooms between Radio Sawa and Al-Hurra. So a lot of reporters are expending a lot of time and energy and money to produce news content in audio form that's simply not being listened to. So I think if this were a corporate project, it would have at least 10 years ago been restructured or shifted in a functional way. But again, the impetus, or at least the justification for keeping it running in its current form, has always been, well, if you can't fix it, let's just keep it running. It's sort of like an old car that you're like, okay, if I try to fix it and I don't know what I'm doing, if I don't have the manual for it, then it's probably a greater risk than actually trying to fix it. So, I have a lot of recommendations for what could be done. From a cultural standpoint, I think the network, the station could do a lot more in terms of situating these sort of musical genres and musical histories and explaining them and help support sort of a cultural renaissance. Not that you expect Radio Sawa to do so, or that that this is something that Washington policymakers are actually contemplating. But I think there's certainly a need for and a curiosity about cultural production that isn't being delivered in this content. And in fact, most radio stations in the Middle East today have programs that are similar to Radio Sawa. So even the particularities that rendered Radio Sawa exceptional or unique in 2003 are no longer unique today. So you may have been the only horse in that race, but today you're eclipsed by everyone else. So there's a lot that needs to be done, but I hope that it was fairly evident that I was using Radio Sawa as a case study to illustrate and explain what I believe are much larger and broader trends in cultural diplomacy conceptualization that are far more instrumental, far more impactful, and have a lot to do with the way in which the United States is actually branded, as opposed to a single sort of network or outlet or station. So this, this presentation grew out of the dissertation, but by the end of the fellowship, it will be a far more extensive book manuscript about cultural diplomacy as a process and the way in which the U.S. is exported as a whole. So Radio Sawa is just a tiny little sliver in a larger sort of complexity. And then perhaps, to answer your question in a different way, the objectives of Radio Sawa need to be revisited as well, and being able to find a balance. I mean, you can have a partisan press, you can have a Radio Sawa that promotes the U.S. government, and it could be a government outlet. I mean, there's no shortage of government outlets in the Middle East. I mean, most stations are either, government networks or supported networks or funded networks or are aligned in some way, shape, or form. So there's no shame in producing that. But I'm not going to use Obama's lipstick on a pig thing, but it's something along those lines that you cannot fraudulently pose as sort of an objective news producer, but not be able, but not deliver it, and instead produce a partisan network that, and nevertheless convince your funders and your supporters that this is what you're doing. So there's an audience problem, there's a conceptualization problem, there's a discursive problem, and then there's a cultural problem. So I think it's already actually happening. That within the Broadcasting Board of Governors, there is a constant debate about how to improve production, but I think maybe it's not asking the difficult questions.
Can I just have a follow-up, just to clarify? So, by what measure is Radio Sawa considered successful?
Basically, it's market share among listeners in specific locales. So I can tell you that their listenership in Morocco and Jordan and in Kuwait is the highest of all the streams. They're not the highest in their markets, but they are fairly competitive.
Highest in all the streams compared, so this is compared to
Compared to,
other...
let's say, the Egyptian or
really?
or the Iraqi
Okay.
stream, yes. So each stream has its ratings within its respective audience, and Radio Sawa is competitive in those three markets. So they're top 5 in all 3 of those markets. In Egypt, they're practically non-existent. So their listenership is extremely low, and it's not on FM. So in Iraq, they've dwindled significantly. So those are the 3 markets where they're still there, and it has a lot to do with the fact that let's say in Morocco, in many instances, the Moroccan sort of local musical production tends to be extremely local or basically Franco-Arab, whereas Radio Sawa is slightly more transnational. So it's able to cater to that audience in a way that most other local production can't. In Kuwait, most local musical programming is fairly limited in scope and is not particularly Western. So they've become the providers or the purveyors of American or Western music production. And in Jordan, Jordan's Jordan. You know Jordan more than I do. But everywhere else, they're not performing particularly well. But at the end of the day, I think the manner in which Radio Sawa is judged by the Broadcasting Board of Governors to incentivize future funding is driven by the fact that their market share remains primarily young. And so long as they have that young audience, even if it was sort of a small proportion, it was still more than what they were getting with Voice of America Arabic. I mean, that's always the comparison. Anytime focus groups will sit down or there's a discussion at BBG, it's like, is this better or worse than where we were in terms of audience share? And are we prepared to do anything dramatic to it? And the answer is always yes. The ratings are higher now than they were before.
And are they doing any research on reception? Because you mentioned something along those lines.
Yes, they are. They do regular ratings, and surveys in each of their markets, and it fluctuates. But the one sort of steadfast pattern that's unchangeable is the fact that the majority of people listen to Radio Sawa for music. That is the one sort of finding. And so in many instances, people who are surveyed will say, please reduce the number of newscasts, or please shorten the newscast, or please make it more interactive, or, they're all, expectations or requests of this kind. But to continue to operate as a public diplomacy instrument of the Broadcasting Board of Governors, and to justify the funding that they receive, they need to have those newscasts. So, it's a catch-22.
Thank you, Adel, for this. Two questions, or one comment and one question. One of the things I discovered yesterday was that Al-Hurra offers to pay people to do interviews with them, which may explain why they have a large budget. I didn't know that you, as a journalist, journalists could offer to pay somebody to interview them, but that was what they sent me in an email.
How much are you paying?
They wanted to pay $150 to answer 5 to 6 questions.
Would this be sort of a live video interview? Yes, I'm sure.
Their team was going to come.
That's not peculiar.
Isn't?
No, it's not peculiar. So the next time that you get an interview request from a station, But here's the thing. In most cases, when it comes to networks that are well-funded, if you request an honorarium, they'll offer it. But in the case of Radio Sawa, because in many instances when they ask sort of scholars of the Middle East or people in the Middle East to conduct interviews, in many instances they'll turn down the interviews. So the money, the small honorarium ends up being an added incentive. But it's not peculiar. So Al Jazeera pays, Al Arabiya pays, most of these networks, if you request, they can't turn you down. And it's actually budgeted by the length or the duration of the program. So a single news hit is worth like $150 to $200. This is the industry secret, by the way. Nobody knows this. But because if word gets out, and in the case of longer segments, if you do like a half-hour interview, it can be as high as $500. So yeah, it's not peculiar at all.
Keep talking for 30 minutes.
Yeah.
My question.
You see why I'm long-winded? Media scholarship and stuff.
My question is more about who are the people behind all of this. So in terms of conceiving of Radio Sawa, in designing the programming, in all of those things, can you talk a little bit more about
Sure.
that? Both on the American side, on the Arab American side, and on the Arab side, and in terms of professions?
Yes, I can speak a little bit to that. I want to at least keep a few mysteries for when the book comes out, so I'm not going to reveal everything. But I can tell you that the architect of Radio Sawa specifically is a gentleman called Norman Pattis, and he is sort of a venture capitalist who invested in private radio across the country. He owns a company that runs somewhere in the range of 3,000 stations across the country. Mostly, his market share is mostly music, and depending on the market, of course. So in some instances, it's country music, in Wyoming, and Idaho, and Texas, and elsewhere in other places. So it caters and is tailorized to various markets. And he was brought on board by the Bush administration to build something akin to the for-profit music station model, the sort of disc jockey sort of radio approach, and to transfer it to the Middle East. Of course, that grew out of most of the Gallup and Zogby polls that seem to illustrate that the majority of young people in the Arab world are compelled by or attracted to or interested in American popular culture and music and cinematic production, but very antagonistic to American policy. So that was a decision made at a very early point, as early as late 2001, like shortly after September 11th. And so Norman Pattis was given the mandate to set up this broadcast, and he essentially presided over the Broadcasting Board of Governors as sort of the creative, as far as creative input and production and stylistics. And so when you listen to Radio Sawa, it does resemble, top 40 hit radio stations in the US. It was modeled to be precisely that. And even though newscasts are rarely a part of this kind of model, it was nevertheless forced in so that, again, it can justify being a public diplomacy venture. In terms of who was hired or who was brought on board to set up the programming from the Arab American community, a lot of this is stated anecdotally speaking, but it has a fair amount of legitimacy to it, that basically the early staffers were cherry-picked specifically to deliver messaging that was very politically driven and politically aligned. So most of the staffers, the early staffers, were chosen on the grounds of their support for the Iraq War, because again, this was, in the run-up to the war, so of course there was a very high favorability, favorability indexes or approval ratings for the war were extremely high before the war began, and it was a deeply polarizing issue among Arab American communities, so there needed to be fluent Arabic speakers who supported the war and were happy to deliver this kind of messaging without significant rebuttal. And in many instances, the downside was actually the linguistic. So the early critique of both Radio Sawa and Al-Hurra, which sort of came out in tandem with each other. Al-Hurra came out shortly thereafter and literally in time for the Iraq War. That during that period, the quality of Arabic, spoken Arabic on air was extremely poor, largely because the hiring process privileged those who were sort of politically, harmonious or politically in agreement at the expense of their ability to produce. So in many instances, even the staffers who were part of VOA for lengthy periods of time, many of whom I've actually interviewed in the study, had actually been asked not to participate, or they were sort of firewalled out. They were not going to be involved in this small production. And in fact, it was the Radio Sawa itself was created as an entity apart from Voice of America completely. So if you look at the architecture of the Broadcasting Board of Governors, you've got Voice of America with all of its linguistic streams, and then you've got the Middle East Broadcast Network, which is literally an offshoot that carries Radio Sawa and Al-Hurra, and they've not only sort of separated it from the rest of the enterprise so it doesn't fall under the same set of rules, even when it comes to journalistic practice and VOA's code of ethics, but structurally speaking, they've relocated all of those out of the VOA building and offices to a facility in Springfield, Virginia. So they are literally, psychically, physically, geographically apart from everything else. So that's again anecdotal, but also with some degree of verification what happened at the early part. But there is of course a case to be made when the Iraq War became far less popular and things didn't go particularly well. That there was, I wouldn't call it exactly a mutiny, but there was a desire for accountability during late 2006 all the way through 2008, and most of the people who were running the station at the time either retired or left and were replaced by the new. So the station is far more complex and nuanced than what it was when it first came about.
I'm afraid we've run out of time, so I'm going to just thank you again.
Thank you.
For this wonderful. Thank you all for
Thank you.
I also want to thank Elizabeth Sexton who helped organize this. Thank you very much, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
And we're having a small reception, so please join us and you'll be able to keep asking Adel as many questions as you want, because there's no time limit there. Thank you very much.